to read a story called The Promise Quilt by Candace F. Ransom, illustrated by Ellen Byer. The genre of this story is historical fiction. So before reading the story, I might discuss with my students what historical fiction is. I would explain to them that historical fiction is a story based on historical events that did happen in history, but that the story itself is fictional or made up. Also, prior to reading the story, I would take a picture walk throughout the book, showing the students the pictures on every page. And this would give students an opportunity to kind of get a feel for the story prior to actually reading the story. They can make predictions on what they think might happen during the story during this time. So we're going to do that, starting with the title page. And as we're flipping through, I want us to notice the landscapes, how they might change or stay the same, and why. I also want us to notice the characters and their facial expressions. How are they feeling? Are they happy? Are they sad? What do you think may have happened to make them feel the way they feel? What are they wearing? Why are they doing the things that they are doing? How do all these things contribute to the story? Since the story is called The Promise Quilt, we might pay particular attention to the quilt. What role does it play in the story? Why is it important? What maybe does it symbolize? One more thing I would do prior to reading the story is I want to give my students a purpose for reading. This way, while I'm reading the story, they are engaged fully throughout the whole story, and they have something to listen for. This will help students not get distracted or lost during the story, and they will actually be engaged in listening the entire time. There are two things I want my students to listen for while I'm reading this story. As I'm reading the story, I want each of my students to have a sheet of paper out, and I want them to jot down some vocabulary words that they hear during the story. And these may be words that they don't necessarily know, or that they don't have a full understanding of and they want to know more about them. So these would be words that they are unclear on. Also, I want them to think about ways that they themselves, or somebody that they are close to or know, can relate to this story. How the events that happen in this story are relatable to their actual lives. And these are discussions that we may have at the end of the story. So now let's begin reading the story. The Promise Quilt. When I was little, Papa and I often leaned against a coffee tree to watch the sunset over Lost Mountain. When you are bigger, Addie, I'll take you to school on the other side of the ridge, Papa promised. You'll learn to read and write and make your mark in this life. Back then, my life was Papa and Mama and my older brother on our little farm tucked into the lap of Lost Mountain. I thought the world ended over that rise, and for 5 springs it did. War came to Virginia. Men from faraway states marched off to fight for something called the cause. Papa stepped outside and met the war in his dooryard. He left one rainy day to be General Lee's guide. The last thing I saw was his red flannel shirt. So a question I might ask my students at this point in the story is, what do you think the cause is? The dull boom of distant cannon circled Lost Mountain like endless thunder. Sometimes shells whistled overhead, Mama, Aldine, and I would hide under the kitchen table, holding hands and praying. Soldiers tramped through our farm, blue coats and gray. They killed our pigs and chickens and took our fence posts for firewood. Mama read us Papa's letters from places like Antietam Creek and Gettysburg. He wrote them on the backs of broadsides, his script cramped to save space. The seasons dragged by. Mama turned my dresses twice because we couldn't buy calico, and tried to hide her tears when the army chopped down our coffee tree. At last the war was over. A neighbor told us that General Lee had surrendered to General Grant. Every day, weary soldiers straggled past our farm on their way home. But not Papa. At first I thought he was lost, like the cause everyone talked about. Then we learned Papa had died in a northern hospital. A lady from Pennsylvania sent Mama his red shirt. Mama gave it to me. So at this point, I might ask my students, what do you think Papa's red shirt symbolizes, or why do you think it is important? Aldine said we were poor. We still have each other, Mama told us. We just don't have any money. In Papa's tin box, we found a stack of Confederate notes and a 25-cent piece. The bills were worthless, but Mama bought a sack of corn with the silver coin. My brother hitched himself to the plow. I dropped seed in his crooked rows, 4 grains to the hill. 1 for the blackbird, 1 for the crow, 1 for the cutworm, 1 to grow. Papa had taught me that rhyme. I pushed the warm red dirt from my toes and thought of him. We ate boiled turnip tops until the corn came in. Aldine scored and charred countryside for stove wood. I miss Papa more each day. Yet Mama still sang her favorite hymn. Beyond the sunset's radiant glow, there's a brighter world, I know. I wondered if the world would ever be bright again. When the corn crop was ready, Aldine and I toted a hefty bag to the grist mill. Barren woods along the road showed blackened stumps like rotted teeth. One tree was so riddled with lead, it couldn't even be split for kindling. The mill had been a hospital during the war. I spied writing scratched on the damp stone walls. What are those words? I asked the miller. The names of the wounded and dying, he said. I traced rough-edged letters and wondered where Papa had left his mark. That summer, Aldine found a bee tree. We had wild honey to drizzle on our cornbread. Mama and I picked the last of the blackberries, standing hip-deep in brambles. I wore Papa's shirt to keep from getting scratched. At last it was time to go to school. There is no school, Mama told me. The soldiers burned it. But Papa promised, I cried. He said I would go to school when I was bigger. Mama thought for a moment. Then she said, maybe we'll find a way. I wonder how Mama will find a way for Addie to go to school. Think about this as we continue reading the story. She met with our neighbors. Mr. Brown would let us use his shed while the men rebuilt the schoolhouse, but we still needed books and slates. Mama wrote to the lady in Pennsylvania who had sent Papa's things, asking if she knew how we could get books for our school. The Pennsylvania lady replied that she'd be glad to help. If Mama would make a quilt, she would raffle it. The money could be used to buy books. Mama dug out her rag bag and laid scraps in a checkerboard arrangement. This is a new pattern, she said. It's called We Surrendered. Why do you think Mama called the pattern we surrender? Night after night, she stitched on the quilt. I sat on the rug and sleepily watched the needle dart in and out. Soon we would have our books, and I could go to school. But one evening, Mama sat down on her hoop. I don't have enough material for the border, she said. I can't finish the quilt. I was snuggled in Papa's shirt, the only thing I had to remember him by. I couldn't give up Papa's shirt. But then I realized the quilt wasn't just for me. It was for all the children who wanted to go to school and make their mark in the world. Slowly I slipped off the shirt. Use this, I said. Addie, are you sure? Mama asked me. This is all we have left of Papa. We have memories, I said, and Aldi nodded. Mama hugged me. I promise to save you a little piece. Red will look nice mixed with the blue border. She scissored Papa's shirt into strips. Then she picked out the stitches from the blue border and started over. As she sewed, I watched the red shirt become part of the pattern. I thought about Papa's promise. In a way, he was keeping it. So at this point in the story, what do you think this red shirt symbolizes? You can think about the first conversation that Papa and Addie had at the very beginning of the story. When the quilt was finished, Mama sent it to the lady in Pennsylvania. The quilt was raffled. The lady wrote to us. It fetched a good price. One fine morning, we received a box of books so new, the covers cracked when we opened them. I breathed in the wonderful smell of words yet unread. On the first day of school, I hiked over Lost Mountain with Aldine. On the other side, a stream of eager-faced children poured into Mr. Brown's shed. No one minded sharing seats or using splintered boards nailed to the walls as desks. Teacher had hung a tattered map of the United States to cover the bullet holes. She showed us Virginia, one state among many. Later, teachers taught us how to print our names. I stared at the letters on my new slate. I had finally made my mark in this bright new world. Papa would be proud. And then at the very end, there's just an author's note about the Civil War and what was going on in this time. So after reading the story, I will pose a few discussion questions I will have with my students. The questions that I would pose are, in what ways does the story relate to your life of somebody that you know? How does that make you feel? And that was a purpose for reading. So the students should have been thinking about that during the story. What is the most significant event that is taking place in the story, and why is it significant? If the events that took place in the story happened to you, what kind of impact do you think it would have on you and your life? Also, after we have these discussions that are deep and more symbolic and more critical questions, we'll go over the vocabulary words that the students made a list of, and then we will also revisit the text to find these words and to see the context that they are used, so that way we can maybe try to make a definition. Then we can double check our definitions with a dictionary to see how close we were. So I want to bring the story together to a close by talking about the theme of hardships and loyalty and values, like making promises, like being there for your family, for your country, your loyalty to your country. But sometimes a father's loyalty to their country poses hardships on the families because they're stuck in a hard spot to fend for themselves while the father is off to war. The war that's being fought during this time is the Civil War, so you can kind of get an idea of how tough times were during the Civil War.